Is it okay
So,
if I have my coffee?
absolutely, absolutely.
Hello and welcome to the ProLongevity podcast. My name is Graham Phillips, the founder of ProLongevity. And welcome also to this, the final episode, the full and final episode with Professor Robert Lustig. We discussed absolutely everything from diabetes, metabolic health, mental health, and what we both agree is a need for regulation of the food industry. We really hope you enjoyed this fantastic episode, and please do comment below and let us know what you thought of it.
I think you need very little introduction, and I'm not going to do one of these long intros because, to be honest, we'd have to spend an hour on the intro, which I guess isn't necessarily the most productive thing. So I'm just going to briefly.
I'm not interested in hearing about myself. That's
exactly. So all I'm going to say is that you're a pediatric endocrinologist. And you're extremely highly respected in my world. And my world is the world of eat real food, let thy food buy thy medicine, and let thy medicine be thy food. And as is well known, you're the author of several different books. We're here to talk today particularly about Metabolical. But in addition to having written many books, you've written numerous scientific papers. And I think the point about you, Robert, is that everything you say is based in science, based in evidence, and based in clinical practice. And I think that's pretty unique in our world. So we are honored and delighted to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Graham. But to be honest with you, I don't know why that's so unique. That's what it's supposed to be about. And the funny part is the science works. And, I think people know that, or at least some people know that. But, we've learned a lot about social media lately.
Some people call it anti-social media.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm very anti-social media. Basically, I let the science do the talking.
Yeah, I think it's the way that you're able to articulate this complex science, which kind of is a lovely segue, actually, because I first came across you because of that incredible YouTube, Sugar the Bitter Truth.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's now, 12 years old.
Yeah.
I didn't think my mother would watch that, never mind 14 million people. I don't get it. I still don't get it.
I think you're underestimating. The last time I looked, it was 15 million.
No, I don't think, whatever.
But I just think, given the subject matter, which is a fairly abstruse 90-minute discourse on the metabolism of a very specific sugar,
right.
What's the background to that video, and why do you think it's become the cult that it has? I came across it out of the blue, and I was spellbound for 90 minutes. I have no idea why, and I must have watched it half a dozen times.
Well, I have no idea why either, because that was about my worst presentation ever. That was the first talk I'd ever given to a lay audience. Okay, I've given talks to scientific audiences for decades, but I was nervous as hell, and because I didn't know if everything I was going to say was going to be going right over their heads. I didn't know if what I had to say was going to be meaningful to them. I had never done it before. So UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, does these mini medical schools for the public, to try to bring the ivory tower science, down to, to the masses, in meaningful bite-sized ways and, on different subjects. And this one was on nutrition. And so I was asked by the head of the CME department, if I would give a talk within that. He didn't tell me what to talk about, but I had realized, just 3 years earlier than that, about, these very specific dangers of sugar. And up to that point, sugar had basically played sort of a non-contributory role to the concept of chronic disease. And I thought, this is what I need to talk about because this is a big problem. And so I put this thing together, not having any notion about the fact that it was even being taped or videoed. I thought I was just giving a talk to 200, lay people in the San Francisco area, and that was it, and it was over. Because if I had known that it was going to be videoed, I'd have worn a better tie. I wore that silver tie. My mother had just given it to me, and I thought it was ugly, but I thought I would at least honor her with.
You made your mum made your mum proud, like a nice Jewish boy should. Yeah,
I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess. Anyway, and that's the story. And all of a sudden, people started watching this thing, and I don't get it. I still don't get it. Every time I look at it, I go like, why in the world would anybody want to like slog through this? But I don't know, they do. I think one of the reasons that that video has done so well is because it actually demonstrates mechanism. When you tell people to do something, they don't do it. When you tell people why, they still don't do it. Okay, but when you actually demonstrate, well, here's what happens when you don't do it, then you finally have a chance for some compliance. And that's what we've been doing in our clinic for the last 20 years, is basically actually sort of taking people through the science and making it clear what the ramifications of your action or inaction are. And it makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea that was your first presentation. I assumed that was, this is your 100th, and you certainly didn't come across as less than absolutely proficient, confident. And my day job, as you probably know, is community pharmacy.
Yeah.
And we see ourselves at that interaction between the patient, the drug, the doctor, the prescriber. So we spend our lives, if we're doing our jobs properly, explaining complex science to people in a way that's meaningful. So, that way of being a professional makes complete sense to me in terms of my day job. Now, like me, you were conventionally trained. And like me, you drank the Kool-Aid, if we can put it that way, and practiced in a conventional way for a considerable amount of time. And then
I would say the first 20 years of my career, I basically did what I learned and I did what I was told.
And guilty, I've written a mea culpa myself about that. What changed? Because something happened that made you not just divert by 10%, but it's a complete U-turn, isn't it, in the whole approach?
I wouldn't say complete U-turn. In Metabolical, I sort of go through sort of my genesis, if you will. I was prepared for this. Chance favors the prepared mind, Louis Pasteur. I majored in nutritional biochemistry at MIT, in undergrad. And I learned very early on that, different foodstuffs were metabolized in different ways and generated different biochemical and metabolic responses. So I had learned that, very early on. Then I went to medical school and they beat it out of me and told me everything that I had learned prior was of absolutely no use in terms of clinical care patients. And I was in medical school to learn clinical care patients. And so they basically told me to cast all of that aside. Whenever I would bring something up in class, I would get from the other medical students, like showing off or whatever. I'm not trying to ask a question, but Anyway, so I just sort of got my head handed to me over the course of 4 years, and these were the gurus. This is how you practice clinical medicine, and prescription pads and procedures, and that's what you learn in medical school, and that's what it's about.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did, and I did that for a lot of years. And then I realized my patients, of course, weren't getting better. And then I also, moved to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1995. And I'd always had this idea about what might be driving obesity. And we had this cadre of very unfortunate survivors of brain tumors. So St. Jude's a cancer hospital. We had all these kids who basically survived their brain tumor, had surgery or radiation on their brain tumor, only to become massively obese. This is a form of obesity called hypothalamic obesity, because it's damage to the area of the brain that controls hormones, called the hypothalamus. And the hormone leptin had just been discovered, just the year before. Now, leptin is a hormone that tells your brain how much fat is on board. And it tells you whether or not you are energy sufficient or energy deficient. And so in that way, it basically either gets you to eat a lot or it stops you from eating.
Yeah.
And it also tells you whether you can burn rapidly or whether you have to conserve.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like a servo mechanism on your house, your thermostat on your house. All right. So when it goes too high, things shut off. Okay. When it goes too low, things turn back on again. And so this hormone leptin had just been discovered. And so I postulated, years ago that because of the tumor or the radiation or whatever, or the surgery, these kids couldn't see their leptin. Right. And I was in charge of taking care of them. And these kids were 350, 400 pounds. And like, what am I going to do for them? Tell them to eat less, exercise more? Actually, George Bray, the father of obesity medicine in America, back in 1975, had locked 8 of these kids up on a metabolic ward at Harbor UCLA Medical Center, threw away the key and gave them 500 calories a day for a month. And they gained weight.
Makes no sense.
Weight.
Yeah.
They gained weight on 500 calories a day because these kids would rather store it than burn it.
Yeah.
Now, we knew that these kids released very, very high levels of the hormone insulin. Okay, and insulin, of course, is the diabetes hormone. You know it well. You probably, administer probably a good 1,000 prescriptions a day for insulin in your, pharmacy practice.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's not really what insulin is. Insulin is the energy storage hormone.
Yeah.
Whatever you're not burning, you have to store, and insulin is the way you store it. And so high insulin to me meant more storage. So I said, well, these kids, their leptin is telling their lack of ability to see their leptin is telling their brain they're starving. So their vagus nerve is putting their beta cells into overdrive. And so they're releasing insulin like crazy in an attempt to try to store more energy to try to get their leptin levels up even higher. But the brain still can't see it because it's dead.
Yeah.
So what am I going to do? How am I going to help these kids? So I said, what if I blocked insulin? What if I got the beta cell to reduce the amount of insulin released? And there's a drug that can do that. It's called octreotide, which I'm sure you also administer.
Yep.
And so we did a clinical trial, open label, 8 patients, IRB approved, all the bells and whistles. And lo and behold, these kids started losing weight. But even more remarkable than that was they started exercising spontaneously. Yeah. One kid became a competitive swimmer. 2 kids started lifting weights at home. One kid became the manager of his high school basketball team, running around collecting all the basketballs. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept. Yeah. This was absolutely mind-boggling that I could change their physical activity. I could change their quality of life by getting their insulin down. Yeah. So we did a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And guess what? Same thing. And we showed that the degree of insulin suppression correlated inversely with the degree of physical activity. So the more we suppressed the insulin, the more physically active they were. Yeah. So what this showed us in a causational paradigm, proof positive paradigm, was that the gluttony and sloth that we associate with obesity are not behaviors. They are biochemistry. Yeah, biochemistry drives the behavior. Right? And I published a paper in 2006 saying that. So that started me on my journey. You asked, how did I become an iconoclast? How did I start, getting, going off the rails, as it were, that was sort of the linchpin that's told me that all the things that I had learned back in college that they told me to forget were actually really what's going on. And really what I needed to do was forget what I learned in medical school. And since that time, I have sort of been a thorn in the side of the medical establishment, and for good reason.
And long may you remain so. You and Asim and Tim Noakes and so on and so forth.
It takes a lot for a doctor to get woke. Yeah. But that's what we are. We're a bunch of woke doctors, that sort of now get the paradigm. It took a while. It's hard when you're not taught it. You sort of have to find it yourself.
all of us have a journey like that. I mean, everyone I've had on the podcast has a journey that ended up not where they started. I mean, the same for me. I was conventionally trained. I thought statins were magic bullets with no side effects, eat a little, all of that stuff.
Right.
Until I discovered for myself, it just doesn't work.
Right. Exactly. It
On
doesn't
an
work.
N=1 basis for myself.
Well,
And you
see,
look
that's
around at your patients and you think, well, I started out as a fresh-faced young professional. I was going to do all this good. And all I'm doing is pumping more medication into people. They don't feel better. I don't feel better. And no one's getting better, but the drug bill's going up.
right. Well, see, that's the thing, Graham, is you just said it. Okay. N's of one are not science.
Yep.
Okay. And everyone is their own N of one. So there may be some patients that statins do work for. Indeed. Yep. If you have familial hypercholesterolemia, God knows you do need a statin.
Sure.
Okay. And a low-fat diet and a lot of prayer too.
Yeah.
All right. But that's your N of one. Okay. And familial hypercholesterolemia is only 1 in 500.
Yeah.
So for that patient, they need a statin. So I'm not telling you get rid of statins. I'm telling you, use the statin for the right patient.
100%.
Okay. You fix the pathophysiology and then the medicine works. So I'm not anti-medicine.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is that the diseases that we treat, these chronic metabolic diseases that currently account for 75% of all healthcare expenditures in the US and the UK and many other developed countries around the world. Okay. These 8 diseases, and here they are. Ready? Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease.
Yeah.
These 8 diseases, which now account for 3/4 of all the healthcare costs, they are not druggable.
Yeah.
Okay. You are a pharmacist dispensing medications for all 8 of those diseases, yet those diseases are not druggable.
Yeah.
What you're drugging are the symptoms of the disease.
Yeah.
You are not reversing the disease. Not one of those diseases has a reversal with medication.
Yep.
Okay. So yes, high LDL. Statins treat high LDL. I don't argue that, but the high LDL is not the disease. The high LDL is the symptom of the disease. Okay. High blood glucose. Yes, oral hypoglycemics and insulin treat the high blood glucose. I don't argue that. Okay.
Yeah.
But the high blood glucose is not the disease. It's the symptom of the disease. Disease is still there. Okay. And it never goes away. Okay. In each case, we are treating the symptom, not the cause. And when you treat the symptom, nothing gets better. It's like giving an aspirin to a patient with a brain tumor because they have a headache. Might help the headache, ain't going to do a damn thing for the brain tumor. And this sort of epiphany, this sort of notion that, yes, the diseases that are, the ICD-11 codes are actually not the diseases, was the reason why I had to write the book.
Yeah. So
what are the diseases? And this is where the longevity piece comes in. Okay. So in the book, I describe the 8 subcellular pathologies that go on inside all cells in your body all the time. And they are part of normal living. You can't stop them. What you can do is you can either speed them up or slow them down. That's what you can do. Now, when these 8 subcellular pathways are working right, you'll be 110 playing tennis. You will have the ultimate in longevity. You will not just have longevity, but you will have health span.
Yeah.
In other words, you'll be, as was said, you'll die young as late as possible.
It's interesting because you made a conflation to get metabolical of diabolical and metabolic.
That's right.
And my program is also a conflation of longevity and pro. And I spent so long thinking up the name because the whole point is, to live longer in good health, or as you say, die young at a very old age, or however you want to put it.
Right.
I completely agree.
Dying young as late as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
So that is, in fact, you brought me on to my next question, which is what I think you call it Cell Biology 101, which is chapter
Yep.
7. And
Right.
you go on to describe these eight processes.
That's right.
And it's with great clarity. So would you be kind enough to sort of take us through that?
Absolutely. So these 8, and I call them in the book the hateful or the grateful 8, with apologies to Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
All right. So these are subcellular processes that always go on. Okay. You can't stop them, but it depends on how fast they're running. And there are things you can do to modulate those. All right. And here they are. Number 1, glycation. So glycation is what causes hemoglobin A1C to form. So diabetics know all about hemoglobin A1C. And obviously, the higher the blood glucose, the higher the hemoglobin A1C. That's true.
Yeah.
Point is that glycation process is underlying the changes in diabetes that lead to chronic disease. What it's doing is it's causing the proteins where this glucose is binding, non-enzymatic glycation. So a binding of glucose to a protein, it's causing it to become less flexible. It's causing it to potentially not be able to bind other hormones, receptors, or activate kinases like they should. So basically wears it out and becomes sort of stiff and inflexible. And that has its own metabolic detriment. And every time that reaction occurs, number 2 occurs, called oxidative stress. Now, so when that reaction occurs, that Browning reaction, that's why you get cataracts and wrinkles, is glycation. Every time that reaction occurs, you release a reactive oxygen species, an oxygen radical, like a little hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah.
Now, hydrogen peroxide is good when you're trying to kill the bacteria on a wound on the outside of your body. It's really not good when you're generating it inside your cell, because it'll kill your cell. So you have to quench the toxicity of the oxygen species, okay? And antioxidants do that. And the antioxidants are located in a part of the cell called the peroxisome. And if you have enough antioxidants and your peroxisomes are working well, then you can do that. You can quench those reactive oxygen species. But what if you're eating processed food and you're not getting enough antioxidants? Then those reactive oxygen species are going to run rampant, and the peroxisome is not going to be able to do it. And what's going to happen is you're going to end up with something known as the unfolded protein response, or endoplasmic reticulum stress. And it has been shown that this phenomenon is what leads to insulin resistance in the liver and insulin deficiency in the pancreas. Basically, that process is what leads to diabetes.
Yeah. So
you got to clear out the oxygen radicals. All right. Number 3, mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondria are where cells burn energy, but mitochondria can burn it well or it can burn it poorly. And when it burns it well, you get lots of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which are the chemical, it's chemical energy that your cell uses to power itself. Yeah. And if they're burning poorly, then you're not going to get as much, and you're going to get leaky mitochondria that are going to make more reactive oxygen species. So you have to have, shall we say, fresh and able and agile and strong mitochondria. And there are a lot of things you can do to poison your mitochondria. And if your mitochondria are not working well, you're going to end up with chronic metabolic disease as well. Fatty acids, the type of fatty acids you take in, contribute to whether your mitochondria will work well or not. Yep. And it turns out there is one particular toxin that poisons mitochondria directly, and it's called sugar.
And fructose in particular?
And fructose in particular. Glucose, the other molecule in sugar, actually makes mitochondria work better. It activates an enzyme in the mitochondria called HADH, hydroxyacyl-CoA dehydrogenase, which actually increases mitochondrial ATP output. But fructose inhibits 3 separate enzymes necessary for mitochondria to work normally. AMP kinase, which is sort of like the power switch for the mitochondria. ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is the enzyme that starts breaking up the fatty acids into its component 2 carbon fragments to make ketones. And finally, CPT1, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is the regenerator of the shuttle that the mitochondria use to get fatty acids into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. So fructose, and therefore sugar, ends up being a mitochondrial toxin.
Yeah.
We always say that sugar is energy. No, it's not. It's energy if you burn it in a bomb calorimeter. It actually inhibits energy generation if you consume it. So this is a major sort of revelation for people, is that sugar is actually a toxin. Okay, toxin to your mitochondria. Number 4, insulin resistance. Now, everyone's heard of insulin resistance nowadays, but no one knows really what it means. Turns out it's true that when you are insulin resistant, your body doesn't work well. That's true. But different organs in your body can have different degrees of insulin resistance at any given time. And everyone thinks that obesity is the cause of insulin resistance. That turns out to be on its head. It's really insulin resistance that's the cause of obesity.
Absolutely.
And understanding that subcutaneous or big butt fat actually contributes very little to insulin resistance, but liver fat and visceral fat are the primary drivers of insulin resistance, make people realize, oh, okay, it's not the fat on my behind that matters, it's the fat in my belly. It's not the fat I can see, it's not the fat on the scale that matters, it's the fat I can't see that matters. Right? And then the question is, where'd that come from?
Exactly. And I think the point is that it's not the amount of fat, it's where the fat is.
That's right.
And actually a tiny amount of fat in the liver and in the pancreas and wrapped around the viscera that you can't see, but doesn't weigh very much, is the clue here.
That's right. Exactly right. So insulin resistance, but you have to know why. And not everybody has the same reason for their insulin resistance. So if you're really going to attack the problem, you have to understand where the problem's coming from. And so that's why you need personalized nutrition.
Yeah.
Number 5, membrane instability. So, imagine all of your cell membranes are like balloons. So imagine you blow up a balloon, all right, to its, before, right up to its breaking point, but it doesn't break, okay? So you've got a blown up balloon. You try to use your finger to pop the balloon. Can't do it. Just comes right back, right? Now, if you use a pin, it'll pop.
Yeah.
Right? But your finger can't do it. Now, let that blown up balloon slowly deflate over, say, 2 to 3 weeks until it's finally like deflated, right? Because the air will escape, through the membrane. Now take that same balloon that had been blown up and blow it up again. Now use your finger. Now you'll pop it.
Yeah.
Okay. You have changed the membrane fluidity because of the stress on the membrane. Well, that happens to all your cells, and especially your neurons. And so there are things you can do to try to support that membrane fluidity to make those neurons and cells in your body in general much healthier and be able to withstand that distensibility. And they're called omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah.
That's what omega-3 fatty acids do. They help stabilize membranes and they help promote neurotransmission in a good way in the brain. Okay. Number 6, inflammation. Now, we've always known inflammation is bad for you. All right. I mean, it's good for you when you're trying to fight off an infection, but it's bad for you when you're not. Okay. And it's bad for you when you overdo your inflammation, like COVID-19, the cytokine response. That's what ultimately kills you. All right. So regulating your inflammatory response is absolutely essential. But if your inflammatory response is going on all the time, then that's really bad. All right. So how come everyone's now inflamed? And the answer is because it's coming from your gut.
Yeah.
Your gut is inflamed. Well, why is your gut inflamed? Well, because you're not feeding the bacteria in your gut. You're not feeding the microbiome. And so when you don't feed your bacteria feed on you. They actually strip the mucin layer right off your intestinal epithelial cells for food. And that denudes the intestinal epithelium and allows for stuff in the intestine that shouldn't be getting into your bloodstream to be able to get there. And that's called leaky gut. And so this phenomenon of leaky gut lets the cytokines, the polysaccharides, whole bacteria for that matter, in, and then that goes to your liver and causes liver inflammation, and that causes liver insulin resistance too. All right. Number 7, methylation. So your DNA can be methylated in certain places. And when it does, that means it's going to change the transcription of whatever that gene is, and likely, in most cases, decrease the amount of whatever it is that's being made. And so you're going to end up having cell dysfunction because you methylated a place you shouldn't have. Well, that's what folate and B12 are for, is to sort of limit that degree of methylation. All right. And, B12 is in relatively short supply unless you take B12 shots.
Yeah.
And finally, number 8, my favorite, autophagy. So autophagy is self-eating, autophagy. Okay. What it is it's clearing the garbage. All right. So your cell makes garbage, just like you do. All right. So let's take your house. All right. And, the garbage men come and pick up, your garbage every week. But what if they go on strike? Well, the first week, not much. Second week, it's going to start to smell. Third week, you might get some, unwelcome visitors in the form of
a few rats. Yeah.
And by the 4th week, the rats start coming. By the 5th week, your drains are going to be starting to clog. Okay. By the 6th week, you're going to have to move out of your friggin' house. All right? It's a buildup. All right. But, the bottom line is you got to take the garbage out. All right. They got to come collect the garbage. Well, autophagy is garbage night for the cell. All right. Every cell in your body makes garbage. Protein aggregates, lipid peroxidation products, defective mitochondria. They have to be cleared out. Otherwise, you're building on landfill. All right.
Yeah.
So, all right, you want your cells to be as streamlined as possible. They got to clear the garbage. And that's a process called autophagy. And it turns out there are certain things that can inhibit autophagy. And all the things that inhibit autophagy also contribute to chronic metabolic disease. So, and by the way, that's why you sleep. That's garbage night for the brain.
Absolutely. Yep.
So that's what's happening while you're sleeping, is all the junk is actually being removed because the pressure in your head has gone down while you sleep. And that allows for these openings between the brain and the coverings of the brain, the meninges, to open up, and they're called glymphatics, and they allow for cerebrospinal fluid to wash over them and basically rinse your brain every day to get the junk out.
Yeah.
So these are the 8 pathologies that are going on in your cells. You can't stop them. The only way to stop them is to be dead. But those 8 pathologies are what ultimately determine how long you're going to live and how well. And it turns out when you actually look at the molecular mechanisms of each of these 8, and I lay it out in the book, not one of them is druggable.
Yeah.
They're all foodable.
Which is why I call myself the pharmacist that gave up drugs.
Right. Well,
because that's the conclusion I reached. Yeah.
So it works at every level, but except, of course, for the food industry.
Yep.
And so, teaching people what the real story is part of my job. So I'm going to pose a question to you, Graham. And I've been posing this question around a little bit now. So I'm going to see how it lands on you.
Yep.
Is ultra-processed food food?
Well, I've read the book and I've seen the video. So hand up, I know the answer. And I completely agree with you. So you've kind of preempted another question. But let me answer it. It's calories. It sure as hell is calories. As you know, if you put it in a bomb calorimeter and burn it, you'll get energy out.
Yep, that's true.
And this is where I think we've got
food.
It doesn't make it food. And I think this is what is such fundamental importance. And this is where the whole myth around calories. I was going to ask you, why isn't a calorie, but we've kind of come to that by, a different route. Yeah. So stuff that contains energy, but which is also a poison, which is what I think ultra processed food is.
That's right.
By your definition and by my understanding, it's not food. It's empty calories. It's devoid of nutrition. It won't ever make you satiated because of the lack of micronutrients. So if you think that food just equals calories, by that definition, it's food. But by any other definition, it's not.
Well, so in fact, Graham, we have to define the word food.
Yeah.
So let's do that. So if you go to Webster's and you look up food, it says substrate used for either growth or burning of the organism. I'm okay with that definition. Yep. That's growth or burning. Okay. So let's take burning first. I just showed you how fructose, that sweet molecule in sugar, inhibits burning. It inhibits mitochondrial function by inhibiting 3 separate enzymes. So even though it's calories, if you stick it in a bomb calorimeter, you get 4 calories per gram. It's actually inhibiting your mitochondrial ATP generation. Therefore, it is inhibiting burning, right? And Kevin Hall at NIH showed that if you give people unprocessed food versus ultra-processed food, exact same number of calories, exact same composition at every level, but one's ultra-processed, one's unprocessed. Turns out the ultra-processed food will make you gain weight, whereas the unprocessed food will make you lose weight.
Yeah.
Okay. So clearly something's happening in burning.
And it's clearly not the calories.
And it's not the calories.
Yeah.
All right. So that's so in fact, the burning part is not met. The criteria are not met.
Yeah.
Now let's take growth. So my colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsenigo Ornan, who is the head of nutrition at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, just published a paper in Bone Research showing that ultra-processed food actually inhibits growth. It inhibits skeletal growth. It inhibits cortical bone formation very clearly and ultimately leads to stunting of growth. In fact, a paper just came out showing that the Dutch, who are the tallest people in the world, this generation of Dutch are shorter than the previous generation. How is that?
Yep.
All right. Where'd that come from?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, maybe it's because what they're eating. All right.
It's so obvious when you start to unpack all this. This is what I've discovered, which is I learned all the science, right? Pharmacy is very, very scientific. It's nothing like as clinical as medicine, but it's very scientific. So we learn, everything from the Krebs cycle to, electron transport chains. We learn this fundamental science.
Right. And then you stop using it.
And then what I don't understand is how all of these professions, pharmacy, dentistry, optometry, medicine, nursing, we may learn more of the science. Generally, medics learn more of the clinical aspects, but we all have a kind of collective understanding. And yet we end up in this bywater that makes no sense. And when you go back to the science, it's so freaking obvious.
Well, this is what cognitive dissonance is about.
Yeah.
You know one thing and then you hear another thing and it doesn't make any sense. All right. And I think all doctors are in this cognitive dissonance because they're taught this one thing in medical school, which I was taught too, and then it doesn't work. And, that's why, we have this, sort of blow up. Now you've got cognitive dissonance in social media, but you've not, but we've got cognitive dissonance in the medical profession, in doctors, dietitians, and dentists. And that's one of the reasons I wrote Metabolical, is to basically explain why they've got the cognitive dissonance, and to take them to task about fixing it.
Yep. Well, next time you take your profession to task, please take my profession to task as well, because we've got a role in all of this and a degree of guilt in all of this as well.
Well, I don't take pharmacists to task, but I take big pharma to task.
Yeah.
So,
So you've kind of touched on this. We've touched on why a calorie isn't a calorie, but another thing that I've heard you, certain things that you've said over time has really struck me. And another thing that you've said is that type 2 diabetes shouldn't be called type 2 diabetes. We should call it processed food disease.
indeed.
And of course, I completely agree, but explain that.
Well, I mean, if you take a look at the data, I mean, you just look at the data. Ultimately, the people think that type 2 diabetes is because you eat too much, except there are a whole bunch of people who are massively obese who don't have type 2 diabetes. And there are a whole bunch of people who are perfectly thin who have type 2 diabetes. So that's not working. I mean, that's not the determining factor.
Yeah.
What we've shown is that there are 3 fat depots. 3. Subcutaneous, or big butt fat. Visceral, or big belly fat. And finally, big liver fat.
Yeah.
Those are your 3 fat depots. Now, let's take the subcutaneous fat first. You have to gain about 10 kilos before your subcutaneous fat will make you sick, before you can start seeing metabolic dysfunction on the basis of subcutaneous fat. 10 kilos, 22 pounds.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, it's true, you can get sick from adding fat to your subcutaneous compartment. I don't argue that. Well, it takes 10 kilos. Why so much? And the answer is because the subcutaneous fat drains into the systemic circulation. It drains into the inferior vena cava, which means that any cytokines or any poisons, any bad proteins that your fat cells make are going to be diluted by your entire blood volume. All right. So you have to have a whole lot of fat to get a high enough concentration to be able to affect other parts of your body, like, for instance, your liver or your brain. All right. Because you have 6 liters of distribution in terms of your blood volume,
yeah,
and also another 40% of your weight in terms of the interstitial fluid. So, you gotta have a whole lot of fat in your sub-Q compartment to get there. Now let's take the second compartment, visceral fat, big belly fat.
Yeah.
Turns out you only need about 2 to 3 kilos of belly fat before you start seeing that. Now, why is the sub-Q fat 10 kilos and the belly fat only 2 to 3 kilos? And the answer is because the belly fat drains into the portal vein, doesn't drain into the inferior vena cava. Anatomically, okay, this is what's known as a portal system.
Yeah.
All right. Now, what is a portal system for your audience? Okay, it's where the blood goes through 2 organs to get back to the heart, as opposed to 1 organ.
Yeah.
Normally, blood goes aorta, artery, organ, vein, vena cava, heart.
Yeah.
In a portal system, it goes aorta, artery, organ 1, vein 1, organ 2, vein 2, vena cava, heart. Okay, 2 organs. And there are only 2 places in the body where there's a portal system. One is hypothalamus and pituitary. And the reason is because the pituitary has to be able to see minute quantities of the hypothalamic releasing factors. And if they got diluted through the entire blood volume, they could never see them.
Yeah.
So that's one portal system. And the other is pancreas, liver.
Yeah.
So insulin drains into the portal vein because the liver is the primary target of insulin action, and visceral fat drains into the portal vein to affect the liver negatively. And so only a little visceral fat will cause your liver to become dysfunctional, 2 to 3 kilos, as opposed to 10 kilos. And then finally, there's number 3, liver fat. And you only need about ½ a kilo of liver fat to be able to cause your liver to be dysfunctional, because it's right there. It's causing your liver to be dysfunctional, at really minute quantities. Now, do you think you can see a half a kilo of liver fat on the scale?
That's the point, isn't it? Absolutely. You can't.
You can't see it.
Yeah.
All right. And that's why thin people are sick.
Yeah.
And they don't know why.
Yeah.
Because they're thin.
Yeah.
Because they're fat. They have fat in their liver. Okay. And of course, the famous ones are the alcoholics. But now we know that sugar makes liver fat just as well as alcohol does. In fact, my colleague Rick Johnson just published a paper that showed that alcohol actually damages the liver because it gets turned into, because it raises the fructose level in the liver. It's actually the fructose that's damaging the liver, not the alcohol. How about that? All right. Paper just came out. So ultimately, what happens at the liver determines how sick you are. And sugar, because it's metabolized directly in the liver and gets turned into fat in the liver through this process called de novo lipogenesis, new fat making.
Yeah.
That's where the action is. The action's in the liver, and the goal is protect the liver. Protect the liver, feed the gut. So protect the liver from the onslaught of sugar, branched chain amino acids, glyphosate, heavy metals, and feed the gut. And feed the gut what? Well, feed the gut fiber, because that's what it eats.
Yeah.
Fiber is food for your bacteria. It's not food for you. Yeah. Okay. So protect the liver, feed the gut. Any food that does both is healthy. Any food that does neither is poison. Any food that does one or the other, but not both, is somewhere in the middle. And the empiric data on any given food and its role in chronic disease actually fits that paradigm. And so that's what I present in the book, Metabolical, is how to think about food having nothing to do with calories, because calories are a red herring.
Yeah. No, beautifully put. I mean, I love the way. I mean, it's fairly. I've read lots of books, right? Lots in this area, and it's very rare that every time I read a book, I learn something. What was so stunning about your book was how you brought all these things together, and I kind of understood all of it, but the way that you bring it all together in a very holistic way, and you tell about the story of the metabolism, and you tell the history of the whole thing, you know, it's really it's a stunning book.
Well, thank you.
I absolutely loved it. So we've kind of established that processed food isn't food, and we've established from a sort of molecular basis why it's not really food.
Right.
And there's so much else in the book. I mean, we could be here for many hours, which you certainly haven't got the time, I'm quite sure. So I'm just going to pick out one or two specific things that I think don't get asked a lot. One in particular was about baby food.
Yeah.
Because my kids are now producing kids. And so I'm starting to look at the baby food that I sell and scream in frustration.
Indeed.
What's your take on baby food?
Yeah, well, there's baby food and then there's baby poison. That's what it comes down to. So baby food is a relatively new invention.
Yeah.
The very first baby food that was commercially available was in the Netherlands in 1901. There was no baby food before 1901. That was the very first, time that there was, a baby food you could buy. How did people feed their babies before that? We had several hundred thousands of years of, feeding babies and children before there was baby food. How'd they do it? Okay. There was no breakfast cereal. There was no, pureed, baby, stuff you squirt in the kid's mouth. Yeah. There was no, here comes the choo-choo, none of that. So how'd we do it? And why did we all die? And the answer is, we did what the birds did. The birds, the mother bird would pre-masticate pieces of food that she would find, and she would then drop it in the baby's mouth, and the baby would gum it to death. Now, we don't do that anymore. Well, one, it's kind of semi-disgusting. And number two, germs and whatever. And number three, we're all worried that the baby's going to choke. Garbage. The baby's not going to choke. In fact, if you look at the number of choking cases, okay, before and after, it did not change. Okay, and I looked. So there, it's not that we're choking. The baby food industry convinced us that we would choke. They created a disease that wasn't there, that their baby food was going to solve. And so what they did was they pureed it. And when they pureed it, they could put anything in it that they wanted. When they put a lot of sugar in it, because then the baby would like it.
Yeah.
Right. So how many times do you have to introduce a savory food to an infant before they will accept it? Median of 13.
Yeah.
How many times do you have to introduce a sweet food to an infant before they will accept it?
Well, I remember my youngest son, Robert, the first time we gave him ice cream.
Uh-huh.
And the look on his face, first of all, he licked it. It was cold. He went, "Bleh." And then he went, and he was hooked. So the answer is once.
Oh, Michael Pollan writes about this in, the Botany of Desire. The first time he gave his kid sugar, and all of a sudden, it's like the kid's eyes widen open. Like, you've been holding out on me. In the world. Yeah. I'm going to devote my entire life to this, and he did.
Yep.
So this is a well-known, well-worn phenomenon for all parents. When they first give their kids sugar. Why babies love sugar? I can't tell you why they do. Their taste receptors, are very prone to and have a predilection for sugar, for sweet. And the point is that it's probably the single worst thing we can be doing for them.
Yeah.
In fact, the American Heart Association has now said that the amount of added sugar we should be giving to toddlers and infants, below the age of 2 is 0 teaspoons. 0. And I'm for that. Point is, that's not what the processed food, baby food industry is selling.
Yeah. And it's not
and
just
they no added sugar on it, but they, apple puree or whatever else, and bottom line is there are a lot of things that double for that.
And not just the sugar, it's all the seed oils that are in there as well. So it's every type of poison.
Well, and now there's heavy metals, here, the FDA, there's this big, conglomeration around this issue of heavy metals in baby food. That the FDA sort of gave a pass on, and it's created several lawsuits here in the US. So this question of baby food is, shall we say, a hot potato right at this very moment. And I think that, what we've done to babies is why we have, obese 6-month-olds. Now, we also have obese newborns before they are even out. They're already obese. So like, what's that about? They don't eat, except they did. Except, well, they didn't eat, the baby food, but they ate mother's food through the placenta. Yeah. And it was always said that sugar doesn't cross the placenta because the placenta doesn't have the GLUT5 transporter, which is specific for fructose. That's true, it doesn't. It has the GLUT7, 9, and 11 transporters, which transport fructose just fine. Okay, they're just not exclusive. Yeah. So it turns out that fructose does cross the placenta, does get into the baby, and has very specific effects on placental function and liver enzyme development, and it's a developmental programming issue. And it basically tells the liver, make more fat now, and they keep doing it. So we actually get babies in trouble before they're even born by what mother consumed. Yeah. So there's a lot of problems. So if it's not just the baby food, I mean, it's what the mother eats before the mother, when the mother's even pregnant. Well, if you're going to fix that, then you got to fix the whole, the whole thing, the whole food system.
So, which brings me, it's pretty much my last question. It's one thing I learned from your book. I'd always understood that the sugar industry had learned from the smoking industry playbook.
Yep.
And one thing that you taught me, it's the other way around.
The other way around.
Which
right.
I never knew that. I never knew
Yeah.
that till reading your book. So that's another
Well, I
thing.
didn't know it either. I
Yeah.
didn't know it either until my colleagues here at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, and Stan Glantz. We call ourselves affectionately the Sugar Hill Gang. Actually discovered the treasure trove of documents from the Great Western Sugar Company, a company that went defunct in the mid-1970s in Colorado. And they found the documents from this company that had been willed to various libraries around the state of Colorado, and started piecing the information back together again and showing that basically the sugar industry knew exactly what they were doing. And they have put their thumb on the scale in so many different ways. I just talked with Kristen yesterday, and she's working on a project right now that shows that the sugar industry actually changed the recommended daily allowances of all the vitamins to allow for processed food to basically, be considered, quote, healthy, unquote, back in the 1940s. So there's a long history of food industry subterfuge.
Yeah, it's absolutely disgraceful. So I don't know if you're going to agree with me about this one. I firmly believe that some of the best things that ever happened was seatbelts and the compulsory introduction of seatbelts, and the way that the smoking industry has been increasingly demonized, and now we're seeing smoking rates come down from 80% to somewhere below 15%. Right. Do you agree with me that the food industry should be regulated in the same way for the same reasons?
Absolutely. So, ultimately, this is a cultural moment. All right. Now, we have had four cultural tectonic shifts in the last 30 years. And you've just mentioned one of them. Okay. Bicycle helmets and seatbelts, smoking in public places, drunk driving, condoms in bathrooms. Okay. 30 years ago, if a legislator stood up in State House or Congress or Parliament or anywhere else on the planet and had proposed legislation for any one of those four, they'd have gotten laughed right out of town. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Okay, this is none of your business. Right? Today, they're all facts of life.
Yep.
No one's belly aching about any of those. And if you pull out of your driveway and you don't have your seatbelt clicked, your kids will scream at you. Believe me, I've tried.
Yeah.
I scream at you. So how'd that happen? And why did it take 30 years? Answer, we taught the children. The children grew up and they voted. And the naysayers are dead. Yeah. That's why it takes 30 years. This is a generational shift. All four of these were generational shifts. They didn't happen immediately. Okay, it took a while, but we teach the children, and then the children adopt these practices. Now we're seeing this with food. Now, okay, the children will change things when they get older. The question is, will we have a planet by then? That's a bigger question. That's a more existential question. Yeah. But ultimately, this problem will take care of itself. I would say we're about 8 to 9 years into this 30-year cycle. Okay, people are waking up. People are understanding this. Books like Metabolical and other books that have come out to demonstrate what the problem really is. Okay, and we're starting to teach the children that just because it says it's food, it doesn't mean it's food. And they're starting to understand, and they're growing, gardens in elementary schools. And, we're actually teaching fourth graders, 10-year-olds, knife techniques so that they can actually implement the nutrition education that we're giving them. So that when they go into the store and the mother takes them, for produce shopping, and the kid says, there's an artichoke. Can we have that for dinner? And the mother says, I don't know how to make an artichoke. And the kid says, yeah, but I do. All right. Because the kid becomes the positive disruptive force in the house, to basically get the parents to do the right thing. So we got to teach the kids how to do that. We're starting to do that. So I think this problem will ultimately get solved in the same way these other things did. because these are societal problems. These are not personal responsibility problems. These are public health issues. Okay. And ultimately the society determines it. And we're getting there.
So I think that's a great note on which to end. What I've tried to do is I've not tried to cover the whole book because there's just too much in it. I mean, as I say, it's astonishing. You know, this is a life's work. It really is. The depth.
There's definitely a core dump.
No, honestly, Robert, I've read your other books, but this is just different level. I think it's the completeness of the narrative, and you've packed so much in there. Not much more I can add. Are there any final thoughts or comments or takeaways that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, yeah, you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. That's what it comes down to, right? You have to work upstream of a problem to solve a problem, and you have to know what the problem is. So in the book, first sentence of the book, there's a wasp in your attic. What do you do? Kill the wasp or find the wasp's nest? Okay, you have to work upstream of a problem to solve a problem. Working downstream of the problem only solves the result of the problem. And that's what we've been doing in medicine and pharmacy and nutrition, et cetera, for the last 50 years. We've been solving the result of the problem. We haven't solved the problem. And ultimately, climate change is the same thing. We have to work upstream. And we're not doing that because working upstream is hard. But that's what we have to do. People have to understand that in order to be able to generate enough political will to be able to fix the problem. And so that's what I would, really, sort of leave your audience with. You have to understand the problem to fix it. And we don't.
So listen, Robert, you've been extremely generous with your time and articulate as ever. And it only remains to be really to thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope at some point we can talk again.
Absolutely. Hope in person next time.
Well, I was hoping to come to the Metabolics conference in Israel because I think you were one of the speakers there. So perhaps we can meet there at the next one.
Perhaps, yeah. Let's hope so. I hope, look, I have nothing would give me greater pleasure than to get on a plane and go to London right now. But, unfortunately, we got this virus that we're not solving either.
Yeah. Well, hopefully in the next, things will start to open up in the next year and we'll all be able to travel again.
Hope so.
All right, listen, you take care and thank you so much.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already done so, look at the links below and you can follow Robert on social media. And before you leave, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our media channels. That way you won't miss future episodes with people like Robert and our other amazing guests.